right, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. My name's Brandon. I am a psychology faculty here at Jeffco, and today we're going to talk about some effective study techniques. So what is helpful, what is not helpful, and a little bit about why. So we want to think about when we study that we're not just working hard, but we're working smart. So you've all filled out that little survey there of how you typically study. And hopefully you answered it honestly, what you actually do or don't do, not what you think you should do or don't do. And what might be interesting is that some of the things that we typically think are helpful, research shows is not. So any surprises up here? These are all the items, and if you look on your survey there, I believe it's all the even items are the non-effective items. Any surprises here?
The flashcards.
Yeah.
I know lots of my students use flashcards, and they think it helps them.
And the key here is that flashcards created by someone else. Okay? Because a lot of our students, they go to Quizlet or they go online and they search, hey, anatomy and physiology flashcards. And that may or may not apply to your class. The definitions may or may not be correct. So using the outside sources, that's where the real issue is there, looking for things not provided by your instructor. Really important there. How about one that's commonly surprising is I recopy my notes word for word. Why is that? Why has research shown that's not really that effective? Any ideas?
Because you aren't learning anything new.
You're just doing the same thing over and over again. You can copy a definition 10 times. You might memorize the definition, but one thing I see in my classes in psychology is students may still not know what it actually means, the topic, the content. Okay, so here's things we want to focus on more. Any surprises here? Another thing to think about, how many of these things are we doing? Is there room to add from this list? And so that's one of the things we really want to think about and look at today. So any ideas here before we go through some of these things in more detail?
I guess moving from topic 1 to 2, then back to 1 when you're studying.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that. It's called interleaving because we tend to think, oh, I'll just keep doing the same thing until I master it and do it. But actually, it works better to kind of go back and forth between topics. So the learning pyramid. Many of you have seen this. We're familiar with this. And one of the problems, part of this is on us as instructors, and part of this is on how students prepare. We spend a lot of time in our studying and our preparation up here doing the things that are the least effective. We need to be doing more of this. So in our classrooms, we need more of these things, but outside of the classroom, we need to be focusing on the things that will produce the most retention. So being able to explain, being able to teach material, getting really deeper into the content. And before we get into all these effective techniques, we can't skip over the fact that studying requires work. It requires effort. Okay, so this is another thing. For this amount of time in class, we should be spending, about 3 times as much out of class. If we're not doing that, our performance probably isn't going to be where we want it to be. So there's no skipping the effort that's required. So I've asked this question, and I've tried to collect data in my classes. Does time that you work matter? And so one way I've done this is pulling from Blackboard how many hours students have spent in my Blackboard course shell. So there's things like quizzes. I have flashcards in Blackboard. There are practice tests, all kinds of things that they can use in Blackboard. And what is this telling us? Students who spend more time in the course, they tend to have higher grades. Not really surprising. Now, more specifically, notice the difference between people who make A's in my classes and everyone else in terms of the amount of time the Blackboard report suggests they have spent. Pretty obvious what it's telling us here, right? People who make A's spend on average over twice as much time in the course as everyone else. So there's no substitute for putting in the time. Now, how we schedule our time also matters. How do most students or think about this, when do most students begin preparing for their exams?
Maybe a few days before.
Maybe.
The night of.
Or the night before, the morning of, right? And so that's what spaced practice is, the opposite of that. Instead of waiting until the night before, and a lot of students work really hard. They might spend 5 or 6 hours the night before, but you'd be much better off to spend 5 or 6 hours breaking it down an hour on 5 or 6 different days. So when we work in small chunks, we remember things much more than when we work in one single session. This is kind of a summary of over 300 experimental studies comparing spaced practice versus mass practice being cramming. So notice that when you need to remember something from 8 to 30 days, which is how most of our exams work, you're usually taking an exam over 3-4 weeks of content. Using spaced practice, you remember twice as much compared to mass practice or cramming. Right, so the evidence is really, really clear. That's one of the best things we can do to improve our learning, our memory, is study on different days throughout the week, not wait until the night before. So I've surveyed my students on this concept as well. I asked them, when did they begin studying for the test? And notice that by far, the highest scores, the group that said I started studying since the beginning of the semester compared to everyone else. Really big difference. Now, I looked at this a different way too. What percentage of students, and these are students in introductory psychology classes, what percentage of them do we think said I've studied the whole time? This is for their first course exam, so this is about week 4 of the semester. What percentage would we guess?
Maybe 10%.
Pretty close. We had 13%. So the vast majority of students aren't preparing in advance like they need to, right? If we saw the green slice of the pie get bigger, we would most certainly see those scores go up. One of the best things we can do, and one of the key things students need to change. Another thing we need to do is retrieval practice. So the way we prepare for exams needs to be consistent with what we're doing on exams. So a lot of people think of like answering questions as just a way to show what you know, but it's also a way to study. So when you practice answering questions, it improves the likelihood that you'll remember that content. A lot of us, we just passively look at our notes, we passively read the chapters, but we don't practice actually retrieving the material, answering the questions. So we want to practice, another way to think of it, what we need to do on exam day. Practice answering questions. The more we do this, the more we'll remember. Take practice tests. If your instructors offer them, use them. I know in my classes, my students have unlimited opportunities on their quizzes. They can take them as many times as they want. Okay, so one, that's a great way to improve their scores, but one, it's a great way to practice. If your instructors don't have practice tests, help generate your own. Work with classmates in groups to write questions, practice answering questions to prepare for the exams. So I've also looked at some data on this. This is data from a test I gave just a couple weeks ago. And I gave students a practice test in Blackboard. It was completely optional. There were no points involved for it. So there was no incentive to do it other than just to prepare for the exam. And consistent with what I expected, those who took the practice test scored about 8 points higher than those who didn't. So almost an entire letter grade higher simply by taking the practice tests. So retrieval practice is a great way to learn, great way to prepare. Another thing we need to do is elaboration. We want to ask questions about the material. We want to make connections to things we already know. Again, we want to avoid just memorizing definitions. So too many students get in the habit of all they do is they memorize the bold words, they memorize definitions, but they can't actually work with the material. They can't explain it. They don't ask or they can't answer those how and why questions. So we want to get deeper into the material, make connections to other ideas. How are different concepts you're working in a class, how are they similar? How are they different? And this is just a few steps to promote elaboration. So most students, what I see that causes a lot of problems is they start with number 1 and they never go any further with the material. They just memorize. So after you've memorized or after you've learned a definition, write it in your own words. How would you define this? Create an example of the concept. with whatever you're working with. What's a real life example, something that you relate to? Generate and answer how and why questions. Okay? Describe similarities and differences, and then create an image, if you can, that represents the concept. So chances are, if you go through and you do this kind of work with the material, with the concepts, you're going to have a much better recollection, a much better understanding. You'll perform much better on your exams than if you just do the definition and stop there. You're going to have much more meaningful learning. So one way to think about this is you're actually working with the material. You're doing things with it, not just memorizing it. So one thing I kind of say to students that I think about, if you want to get better at painting, what do you need to do? You need to paint, right? Will looking at other paintings make you a better painter? Probably not. Maybe you'll see some new ideas. Maybe it'll help a little bit. But if you want to get better at painting, you have to paint. So if you want to get better with the material, you have to work with it. You have to you have to go deeper, not just look at things, but actually work with things. And this leads into dual coding. And so I know a lot of students say, and I hear a lot of people say, I'm a visual learner. Does anyone know what psychologists say about visual versus auditory versus kinesthetic learning, those learning styles that we've heard about a lot?
They don't exist.
Absolutely not. It's total myth, right? Everyone is a visual learner. We are all visual learners. We all benefit from learning things both verbally and visually. So if you can do concept mapping, if you can create an image, diagrams, anytime you can add a visual to the material you're working on, research has shown it makes it more likely you can remember it. And so I think of this kind of simply that if you learn something two different ways, both with the picture, with visuals, and with the words, with the definitions, you're twice as likely to be able to remember it, to be able to understand it when it comes to exam time. So anytime you can add any of these things, any of these visual aids, it's going to increase the likelihood you'll remember things. And this is interleaving. We kind of talked about this earlier. Going back and forth between topics. So what a lot of students do is the first time they study session 1 here, they study topic A, topic A, topic A. And it feels like if I just keep studying it and keep studying it, I'm learning it better. And then the next time they study topic B, 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 C, C, C. This would be a much better way. Working a little bit at a time, going back and forth. Each time you go back to it, you're more likely to remember it, more likely to establish meaningful learning. And this also helps prevent some of that cramming, right? Because when we're cramming, we're just doing the same thing usually over and over again. We want to go back and forth between different topics, also obviously in different study sessions. And the last thing that we don't talk about enough, but we know is really, really important, is sleep. It's hard to underestimate how important sleep is to our learning. And one of the issues that many students have when they cram, what does that tend to do to their sleep when you're cramming the night before a test?
Not sleeping.
You're sleeping less, right? And there's this idea, well, I'll sleep tomorrow after the test. It's too important that I study tonight. I don't need sleep. And we know that's just simply not correct. If you're not getting adequate sleep, your brain isn't performing at optimal capacity. And so a really ingenious study just came out last year. Is a psychology professor issued what he called the 8-hour sleep challenge during final exams. And all students were using the wrist actigraphy devices, so kind of like your Fitbits. So it recorded exactly how much sleep they got. They couldn't lie about their sleep. And if students averaged 8 hours of sleep during final exam week, they got bonus points. If they didn't, they did not get bonus points. And so what they found is that even when they controlled for the previous GPA of the students, those who got 8 hours of sleep performed higher on their final exams overall than those who did not. So many of us tend to think, particularly during final exam week, I don't have time to sleep this week. I'll catch up on sleep next week. But another way to think about it is if you don't have time not to sleep. If you're not getting adequate sleep, you're not adequately prepared, and all that studying you're doing is likely going to be less effective. So we cannot overlook the importance of sleep. And I believe that is the presentation. So any questions? Any ideas? Anything?
Is there any data about the helpfulness of giving students study guides?
Yes, they're not beneficial. So there was another study in the same journal just came out a few months ago, and it was a psychology professor in psychology courses, so it's kind of specific, so it needs more generalization, more replication. But what he found in his classes is that he randomly assigned some classes, he gave them a study guide, and other classes they were instructed to make their own study guides. And the classes where they made their own study guides, they performed higher. Yeah. And so that kind of gets back to that passive learning. Students want a study guide that they can just look through, and I think what they really want is a shortcut, but there's no shortcut for working with the material preparing. And I think study guides, one of the things they talked about in that paper was that study guides sometimes give students a false sense of confidence. They can look through and say, well, I know these terms, I can answer these questions, and think that's all there is. And they are not really getting into the material as they should be. Yeah. But trying to convince most students of that is, not very easy. But I've started talking about that specific study in my classes. I can email it to you if you're interested, yeah. Anything else?
And again, the other thing that I've heard in class is I studied the wrong thing after an exam. And you think, you can't, well, they studied things that maybe didn't help on the exam, but they aren't wasting their time by learning things that weren't on the exam.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of hindsight bias in that too, because they think of like, they think of one or two topics that they spend a lot of time on, but they didn't maybe see a question on. And so they think, well, I studied all of these things that weren't on the test, but they also studied a lot of things that were on the test. And so there's always, I think, some of that feeling in many students, and I hear that feedback a lot too. All right, thank you all for coming.